Dr. Joshua Goodman, who is with us. And Dr. Goodman, in addition to being the course director, and he'll tell you a little bit about that in general, is going to focus on Latin America. And he's an assistant professor in the Benjamin Falloy Chair in International Security Studies at Air War College and course director for the Regional Security Studies program. He's a political scientist and a historian. He's focused on the fields of foreign policy analysis, security studies, and the Middle East. His research and teaching focus is on the impact of civil-military relations and bureaucratic politics on strategic planning. We've lived through that, yes. And military effectiveness, especially during counterinsurgency, as well as the Arab-Israeli conflict and Persian Gulf security. With him and he'll be going second. I'll tell you about the rules of engagement here shortly. Is Dr. Ashley Townsen, who's spoken to us before, should be a familiar figure to us. Welcome back, Dr. Townsen. He's an assistant professor of national security studies at the Air War College, where he serves as course director for the Great Power Studies Core course. Prior to joining the faculty at the Air War College, Dr. Townsen was an assistant professor at Washington State University and received his PhD from the University of Illinois. His research and teaching interests focus on civil international conflict, African security, terrorism, rebellion, and political psychology. And then we are very pleased to have with us, and by the way, Dr. Townsen will be focusing on Southern Africa in his part. And then we have Dr. Alex Lassner, who will be focusing on Eastern Europe. His research and advising interests include foreign affairs and international security policies in Europe during the interwar period, 1920 to 1938. He's got a PhD in MA history from The Ohio State University, specializing in modern military and Central European history. He served as a Fulbright Scholar in Austria and a presidential fellow at OSU. Without further ado, please welcome our speakers, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Goodman.
Hello?
Yes.
Okay, good. Do you want me to use that one?
Is it not?
This second mic here.
This one? Okay, well, let's just put this one over. Can we just put this one over on the table? Oh, okay. Go ahead. Y'all just come on up.
We'll just come up here.
Okay.
Okay, well, thanks for coming, everybody, and listening to us talk about our trips. I was asked to introduce the overall or the broader Regional Security Studies program at the Air War College, and haven't really prepared anything, but I'll just give a couple of highlights and bullet points. And so the Regional Security Studies program really is one of the flagship programs at the Air War College. And I don't just say that because I'm in charge of it, although I think I'm contractually obligated to say that, but it really is sort of a once-in-a-lifetime study opportunity for our students because of the opportunity for experiential learning and to get out of the classroom and to travel. And so basically how it works is that each of us in the university have an area of regional specialization. Mine is the Middle East, but I'm going to be presenting on Latin America, and we can have a conversation later about how that ended up happening. But we spend about 30 hours in the classroom sort of studying the history, the politics, the economics, and the security challenges of a region, and then we take them for 2 weeks into that region. Usually we do two countries. We did two countries here. Sometimes we do three. If we can do that, and it's an opportunity to engage with U.S. government and interagency partners who are working there, often through the U.S. Embassy. And it's very frequently the first and potentially even the only time that the students have the opportunity to go to an embassy and see how that works. And we also have an opportunity to engage host nation partners. Often we go to military bases, we engage with their Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We visit some key economic locations and learn about their industrial bases, their manufacturing, their defense industry, and of course some opportunity to get some cultural cultural engagements in. And so that's kind of the program in a nutshell. And it really sort of allows us to take the concepts that we've been studying in the abstract or in the book in the classroom and allow them to live it and see how it really plays out. And they often come away from it really having learned a lot. They say that it's one of the most academically and intellectually enriching experiences of their time at the War College. So happy to answer any questions about that a little bit later if you want. I think that covers mostly everything.
Let me just, I forgot to go over the ROE. We're going to do about 10 minutes for each speaker, roughly, and then we'll have about a 10-minute question and answer session for that speaker, and then we'll move on to the next one. And I hope at the end it'll just be all of us talking. We'll have multiple conversation involving all of our speakers about it. Thank you.
Okay. And so now I'll turn a little bit to the RSS trip to Latin America that I did, and I've got slides here. Do we have the slides up?
I'll check for receipt of them on email. They come through. One moment.
All right, take 5, everybody.
Were they sent to Dr. Politics or AWAC Lewis?
I emailed them to you and to Dr. Sankey.
Okay, let me see.
That was some days ago, and you sent me an email confirming receipt.
Okay, apologies. It's probably in my other identity. I can't see.
We can switch order potentially if we got a delay.
Is somebody, are you guys just going to plug your own computers in?
Jeremy, if you can't find those right now, you need some time. We could switch the order.
I've got the other 2 slides, 2 sets of slides from today. Apologies for looking for it.
Yeah, so we can have Ashley go and we'll circle back around.
Yeah, we'll start with Dr. Townsen then while you're looking for those slides.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Ashley Townsen. Thank you for the invite to come back and speak with you guys. I've done this a few times, so you know I'm an African specialist. And this is one of my favorite talks every year, so I'm looking forward to the conversation. This year, the group and I went to Southern Africa. I took 13 students, one of which is here, Lieutenant Colonel Kelly Smith in the back there. She sat all the way in the back, so I guess she didn't want anybody to see her. But Lieutenant Colonel Kelly Smith is back there, one of our Air Force students here. And she's a logistician and did a fantastic job kind of planning our trip and setting things going forward. We went to Zambia and Botswana. And for the next few minutes, what I'm going to do, can we have the Africa slides up?
Coming. Okay, and I have the Goodman slides too. Okay.
So while he's doing that, I'll just go ahead and continue. So we went to Zambia and Botswana down in Southern Africa. So the next slide, if you don't mind. And what I'm going to do here is kind of go through the way I see the major security issues on the continent and really in Southern Africa, and then give you some examples of how we learned about them on our trip, and some kind of examples as to where we saw them play out in person, in Southern Africa. And in Southern Africa, I think, particularly in Zambia, our first stop, security issues revolve around the Congo conflict. And so I'm going to spend some time talking about the Congo conflict in just a minute, in particular. And then one of their other major concerns, both in Zambia and Botswana, and really throughout the region in Southern Africa, is anti-poaching. It is a unique set of defense forces down there that their military, in addition to focusing around kind of border security in general, A big portion of what they do is kind of anti-poaching efforts along their borders. And that may seem kind of minor from the US perspective for something for a military to be focused on. But you have to remember, in a place like Botswana, safari-based tourism is 15% of their economy, 15%. And so it's a huge focus of their military to protect the animals that they have, because it is such an economic engine for what they do there. So it's not just a conservation effort, it's actually an economic effort, because they bring people from all around the world to look at their unique animals, and those unique animals are under threat at all times. So for example, in Zambia, we stopped by and saw a rhino, a group of rhinos, and there's only 9 left in the entire country of Zambia. And they have individuals who are with them 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, from their defense forces, who are armed with AK-47s and essentially walk around with the rhinos wherever they go, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to protect them from poachers, because there's only 9 left, and it's such a big economic driving engine of what they do there. In fact, one of our tour guides, we found out later on, was one of these defense forces guys who did that, and this was his day off. He was giving us a tour of around Livingston there in Zambia. So anti-poaching is a big, actually, focus of their military. Corruption throughout Africa is a huge problem. I personally think that corruption is actually the biggest political problem across most African countries, and the thing that holds them back more than anything else from further kind of economic and political development. And I'm happy to talk more about that. HIV and malaria, particularly in Zambia and Botswana, and I'll give you some examples from that. About 20 years ago, in the 2003, 2004 era, Botswana was projected to lose about 45% of its population due to HIV infection. It was the highest rate of HIV infection in the world. As a result of PEPFAR, the program you guys may be aware of, that was started here in the US and funded HIV meds, that didn't happen. And of a country that was projected to lose more than 1 million people, right, lost less than 20,000 people as a result of their HIV medication programs. And so it's still a huge issue for them, but it's something that they have really conquered, particularly in Botswana and Zambia, with US help. But something that they're very focused on, because it's so pervasive there that it would wipe out a generation of their labor force, a generation of their economic and political talent, if they didn't continue to be focused on it continually throughout. And their military does this as well. So their military has HIV and anti-malarial programs in which they are part of the health system in order to address these 2 major security issues. In addition, in the region and in Africa in general, there's a huge youth bulge. You've heard me talk about this before, and I'll talk about it again. People don't realize that Africa is the essentially last place on Earth that is going through a population boom. As the population declines in Europe, as it declines now in China, China's peaked, it's now declining. India is still growing, but India is estimated to peak in about 20 years or so and continue to fall. Well, Africa is not estimated to peak towards the end of this century. So in the 2090, 2100 kind of time frame is when Africa's demographic boom will peak. And to give you kind of some statistics on how drastic this is, recent estimates put the number of people on Earth under the age of 15 in Africa at close to 50%. So 50% of the people under the age of 15 on the planet today live in sub-Saharan Africa. Right? The average age where we went to Zambia is 17 years old. Right? Half the population is over 17, half the population is under 17. To give you a sense, compared to the US, in the US it's about 39. The population boom in some places in Africa is becoming an economic opportunity for them. They're turning it into manufacturing capabilities, attracting businesses in and using this labor force as a way to grow their economy. In some places in Africa, it's a real big political, social, and economic problem. Where we went in Zambia, I think is one of those places where as it continues to grow, it could be a major problem for them going forward and can create social instability to the point where the country may fall apart. Right? Other places in Africa, it's not that, but I'm worried particularly about Zambia being that case because it's such a large population under the age of 17, and its development is so far behind other places in Africa. To give you a sense of where Zambia and Botswana sit, Botswana is basically the richest country in Africa. It's rich because of its diamond wealth and because it's relatively small in population. It only has about 2.5 million people, so it's a relatively small country. Its GDP per capita, so how much wealth it has per person, is about 17,500 US dollars. That's extraordinarily high for an African country, right? They have done very, very well turning their diamond wealth into a robust and developed country compared to other places in Africa. Zambia is the other way around. Zambia's got about 22 million people, right? Its mineral wealth is in copper, right? And its GDP per capita is about $1,300 a year, right, on average. Compared to its neighbor, just to the south, is 17,500. They're at 1,300, right? And they've got 10 times the number of people. So we saw a very stark difference, and I did this on purpose, designed the course this way. I wanted to show them different realities in Africa, because not everywhere in Africa is the same. And Zambia is one of these places that is quite poor, quite undeveloped, and is struggling to turn its mineral wealth into economic opportunities for its citizens. And Botswana is the other way around. Botswana is one of the success stories in Africa that's been able to turn its natural resource wealth into a movement going forward. Then they have single African commodities. That's a major issue for them, and then China and Africa. Quickly, I want to talk about what's going on in the Democratic Republic of Congo, because this is what we heard about in Zambia. When we asked Zambia, what's your major security challenge? We asked the Zambian Defense Force, what are you focused on? What they're focused on is migration and security issues coming out of the Congo, right? So if we can go to the next slide, please. So the Congo has been a war that's been going on in the Congo really since the late 90s. It's had some mid-90s. It's had some lulls where it's gone away, and sometimes it's called the First Congo War and the Second Congo War and the Modern Congo War. In reality, it's all the same war. They just kind of quit fighting for a few years at different times for specific reasons. But regardless of what anybody tells you, this is the most deadly conflict on the planet since the end of World War II. Right? This is it. Not Ukraine, not the Chinese conflicts, this one. Right? North of 20 million people have died in the Congo conflict in the last 25 years. Right? It's just not one that's particularly well global known because it doesn't involve any kind of great powers. But the conflict that's been going on in the Congo is by far the deadliest violent event, continuous violent event on the planet since then. And it's still going on today. In 2025, it's re-erupted in the last year and a half or so. It's largely fed by Rwanda and Uganda falling into the Congo. And it is, if we can go to the next slide, it is all about the mineral wealth in the Congo. Right, so here you have two different pictures from a mine in what's called Southern Kivu, a region of the Congo, in which the individuals there are mining the resources that go in computers and cell phones that are sold in the West. And it is an area of instability that bothers Zambia because people migrate out of this, away from this conflict, fleeing the violence, and end up on Zambia's border. And so Zambia, a country of about 22 million people, has about 1.5 million refugees in it, right, that are almost all from the Congo. And they have UN-run refugee camps along the border in which they try to do their best to support the people that come over from the DRC. And I'm happy to talk about what's going on in the Congo much more during the Q&A. And I think the other great thing that we learned, next slide please, is the great power competition element that's going on in Africa. And this is the competition between China, Russia, and the US. And one of our most fascinating engagements that we went to, and this was kind of a random engagement we did when we first hit the ground in Zambia, is we went to a Chinese museum built, owned, and operated by the Chinese in Zambia that I thought was going to be a museum. And when we got there, what it was straight up propaganda, right? It was just a piece of propaganda targeted at the Zambian people from China to talk about the great relationship between China and Zambia. And we went in there in the middle of the day on a Tuesday. It's closed. No one's there. We had to wake up the guy to let us in, and a Chinese man runs it with one Zambian staff. They had to turn the generators on to start the place up so we could go through it. It took about 20 minutes for them to fire up because it's not connected to the electrical grid. And we walked through it, and it is nothing but lie after lie after lie of how the Chinese people have helped the Zambians, dating back to this railroad that they built in the 60s, designed to influence Zambian political opinion and Zambian political parties to do current and modern mineral deals with China. That's the reason it's there. It's there to create a narrative that China is Zambia's partner, so that the copper that that Zambia has will continue to be mined by Chinese companies. And about 50 to 60% of the copper in Zambia right now is mined by Chinese companies. Right? It's a very, very unique place. In addition to that, next slide, one of the things I think I found most telling from our trip was an interaction that one of our students had with a local in Botswana. This is one of our students here. On the left and on the right is a local Botswana. And our student asked him, "You're young, you're thinking about going to college. Where do you want to go? You want to go to the US?" And he said, "No, I don't want to go to the US. I want to go to China." "Why do you want to go to China?" He said, "Because you can't get in the US anymore." He said, 10 years ago, everybody wanted to go to the US. No one in my generation wants to go because it's so hard to go now. Everybody in my generation who's of the social and economic elite that can go off to college goes to China now. And he was very adamant that all his friends go to China. All the people that were ahead of him have gone to China and come back, and that's where he wants to go as soon as he can be capable of doing it. That interaction, I think, was telling to our students, and it was telling to me that this individual in Botswana, young teenage individual, his dreams are going to college in China, not going to college in the US. In my time in Africa, that's a fundamental shift. 10 years ago in Africa, when I asked people this, nobody mentioned China. Now it's about 50-50. Right? Next slide, please. So my thoughts, where should Africa be in US priorities? Shouldn't be number one. I'm in no illusions. We have problems in Europe. We have problems in the Pacific. Africa is not something we need to be focused on with all of our resources, but it's something that we do need to be paying attention to. Because as I've told you before in this forum, Africa's coming, right? The demographic realities of Africa and the mineral wealth of Africa are gonna make it geostrategically important in the coming decades. It's not there yet, but in 10, 20, and 30 years, the world's focus is gonna turn to Africa because it's gonna have to. It's gonna be required to because of the demographic changes that are coming, right? And so just keep that in the back of your mind. And then finally, Africa's rich in resources. I have some thoughts on what that means for US foreign policy. I actually think Africa's resources aren't as important to us as people think, and I'm happy to discuss that during the Q&A. All right, thank you for allowing me to speak with you. Oh, we got Q&A.
Yeah, you can do questions.
What did you hear about the demise of USAID?
So we didn't hear that much because we were there kind of when the hope that it was coming back was still around. And so what I mean by that is that the Africans that we met with were under the illusion and under the hope that it was being paused and not taken away. And so we had some discussions mostly around PEPFAR. In the places we went in Zambia and Botswana, what USAID does for them more than anything else is provide anti-HIV medications, particularly in Zambia. We provide them in Botswana, but Botswana pays for them a lot on their own, right? Because they're wealthy. We pay for them in Zambia and provide them, and they're scared, without doubt, of what happens to their societies if PEPFAR goes away. To be quite frank, though, we were not allowed to go visit and talk to USAID people while we were there yet, and so we didn't get as much information as I think I would get like next trip or the trip before. Because of our kind of current pause, the embassy said they were worried about our trip and said we're going to kind of shield you from that as much as possible because it's so fresh.
Yes, I just had a question about you're studying the different regions of Africa. How do you go about that selection of which countries you will visit?
Sure. So it's partially our decision and partially the Air Force's decision. And and I'll give you an example. So SAFIA puts out a list of the countries that they would like us to increase our engagement with. And then we take our countries from that list and if they are feasible, use them. So we contact the embassy. So sometimes, like for example, they always want me to go to Kenya, because Kenya is one of the countries that we have a good engagement with and we'd like to continue our engagement with. But sometimes the Kenyan embassy says, like, we got 5 other trips that week, you can't come, right? And so the countries end up being on that list where we can make them work logistically. And then as an academic, my view of Africa is that most Americans don't know that much about Africa. I didn't know that much about Africa until I started studying it. And people think it is a place as opposed to 54 distinct countries. And so I try to pick countries that are as different from each other as possible. So I don't want us to go to 2 African countries that are very, very similar. I want to give our students a kind of developed African country and a very undeveloped, or a very systematic dictatorship and a flourishing democracy. I want to give them a distinction between the 2 countries we go to. That's my personal view when I take my students to Africa.
Jeremy, do you have a question out in your part of the world?
Yes, I'm interested in where the US should place more emphasis in policy in the next few years to improve its standing in Africa. The PEPFAR was obviously a huge endeavor, unexpected at the time, that was seemingly very successful in soft power. So where else can we use our soft power?
So I think we should do, I think there's 2 places that America needs to focus on, and they're related to one another. Because you asked about PEPFAR, I'll tell you my opinions about PEPFAR. I think PEPFAR is probably the biggest foreign policy success the US has done in the last 40 or 50 years. The problem with PEPFAR is that no one knows about it. And even in Africa, no one knows about it. And while the people who get PEPFAR medications in Africa go to distribution sites and get their medication, they often don't know the US pays for them. And so I think one of the focus needs to be, we need to be much more vigilant and loud about explaining what we do to Africans in terms of soft power. The Chinese are very good at this. So you go to an African city and you'll see a giant sign that says built by the Chinese government on some building or bridge or road that they built. And then you'll go to like a building that the US helped pay for, and there's a tiny little 3-inch plaque in the corner. And there's a reason why that's the case. The reason why that's the case is because we started our fundamental aid work in Africa during a time when we didn't have geostrategic rivals, right? It was to our advantage to not tell people we were doing stuff in Africa because we didn't have anybody to compete with, right? The Soviet Union had fallen, China wasn't a thing yet. We got more bang for our buck by not announcing that it was coming from outside of Africa, the aid. That's not the case anymore. And so we need to be, I think, very dramatic about publicizing what we do. Africans love Americans, they just don't know a lot of times that what we do. What I think the US policy should be doing on is that, and the second thing is I think we need to create backfilled programs, backstop programs that allow US private investment in Africa. This is what the Chinese do. So the reason US private businesses don't do a lot of business in Africa is because it's risky. It's very risky to go bid for a copper mine in Zambia as a US company because you can't predict Zambia's political stability in the future. But we could create an insurance program that would support US private businesses doing business in Africa that would be very beneficial to us and to Africans, I think. And that's essentially what China does. There's so much business that China does in Africa because the Chinese government guarantees through a variety of programs that if a Chinese business loses money in Africa, through an insurance program, they'll make that whole. And so Chinese businesses are much more risk acceptance in African context than US businesses are. And I think that's to our strategic disadvantage.
Thank you.
Thank you.
At this time, I think we got Dr. Goodman's slides ready. If you'd like to
Okay,
take them.
Jeremy, I also re-emailed them to you if you want to check it. Was it your Gmail?
They're
Yeah, awesome.
showing,
Thank you.
thanks. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. Keep time, or else I'm just going to go on forever, and I promise you, you do not want that. Okay, so I took my group to Latin America, and that's sort of a Western Hemisphere trip, more broadly construed. And our 2 focus countries were Mexico and Peru. And you can move on to the next slide. Please. Yep. And in addition to going to Mexico and Peru, where we kind of focus mostly on the capitals, we also had an opportunity to go to San Diego and really kind of dive into some of the border security issues that we're facing these days. And so we were able to have engagements with Customs and Border Protection at our border crossings and border checkpoints. We also got to ride along for a while with Border Patrol. We met with the U.S. Coast Guard as well as the California National Guard. From there, we went to Mexico, where we worked with the U.S. Embassy. We did a great engagement with the American Chamber of Commerce, looking at U.S.-Mexican economic relationships, and then we spent some time with the Mexican Air Force. And then in Lima, again, the U.S. Embassy, and we spent a lot of time in the interagency there, talking to DEA, FBI, Homeland Security, so on. We met with the Peruvian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as well as some time with the Peruvian Air Force. And I'm not going to spend very much more time talking about what we actually did on those trips, but rather I'm going to kind of talk about what we saw there and how what we saw there impacts the challenges facing U.S. security, as well as U.S. domestic politics. So next slide, please. As I'm sure you're kind of all aware, right, since the turn of the century, the U.S. really hasn't paid very much attention to Latin America and the Western Hemisphere more generally. First, it was the war on terror. From there, it was the return to great power competition. And for better or for worse, and I would say for better, is that the United States doesn't really face very many military and serious sovereignty, national security threats in the Western Hemisphere, right? We live in a pretty safe and pretty stable neighborhood. But what happens in Latin America really does affect the daily lives and domestic politics of the United States, and I would say that that's true almost more than any other region in the world. And just look at the issues that fueled our most recent presidential election. Right? The Middle East was pretty absent, and even China and the Indo-Pacific were minor. But issues emanating from south of our border in Latin America were arguably decisive. And so in a lot of ways, this is an incredibly important region, just maybe not militarily in the way that we sort of think traditionally about national security. And so when I think about the importance and the challenges that we face in the Latin America region, I kind of like to divide it into these two bins right here. And I'll break down the rest of the talk into the following categories. Right? The first is border security. And I mean that really, really broadly, right? Not just dealing with the security of the border per se, but the challenges of drug trafficking and human trafficking, and goods crossing back and forth, and as well as the importance of our trade with Mexico and how that impacts the U.S. economy. And then the second is sort of our new favorite buzzword, right, which is great power competition. And that has particularly a lot to do with Chinese engagement in Latin America, which has increased significantly over the past 20 years. And I would further break that down, if we've got time, into sort of these two categories, one being economic competition and investment, and the other being geography and geopolitics. Next slide, please, Jeremy. So broadly speaking, we can think of the border problem as the need to balance two issues that are deeply interrelated but kind of are working at cross purposes. The first is sort of the one we're all familiar with, right? The need to prevent illicit trafficking across the border. And that's largely narcotics and irregular migrant flows that are moving north into the US. But increasingly, it's also the flow of weapons flowing out of the United States and into Mexico, and that's fueling Mexico's rampant homicide and violence problem. And the cartels are getting a large percentage of their weapons from the United States because it's so easy to acquire and move them south. The second is the need to ensure the smooth flow of legal goods across the border, both from the United States into Mexico, as well as from Mexico into the United States. And that's important because more and more our two economies are becoming integrated. And so in a lot of ways, it's not even correct anymore to call what flows across the border trade, because instead we need to think about this as vertically integrated manufacturing by US companies that are operating factories on both sides of the border. And so it's vital that this border operates smoothly in order to keep the US economy running smoothly. And that's especially the case with the US auto manufacturers. And so auto parts are produced by Ford, by Chevrolet, and by others on both sides of the border. And as a car is produced, parts and pieces will be assembled here and then moved south into Mexico, where they will be sort of further assembled and then moved back into the United States. And sometimes it's the case that a car, before it makes its way to the dealership, will cross the border 7 or 8 times before it gets to you, right, the end user. And so the stability of the US economy, especially in some of the key products that we're producing, relies on the ability to keep this border smooth and stable. And so the reality is that it's really, you can't just close or seal the border because of our economic integration. But that vulnerability and that importance is what creates the vulnerability for the cartels and for illicit trafficking, right? And so this balance in figuring out how to let legal things through and how to prevent illegal things from crossing is the key. Next slide. So what does this look like? What we saw is that we're facing really 2 main points of vulnerability. The first is what comes through the border checkpoints. The San Ysidro crossing and the Otomesa crossing, these are the 2 in San Diego. One is a passenger terminal, that is San Ysidro, and Otomesa is is the commercial terminal, is one of the busiest points of entry in the entire world. And what we found is that overwhelmingly what's being smuggled through the border checkpoints are drugs into the US and arms into Mexico. The second challenge is what goes between the border crossings, right? Or across the border fence, or in some areas there is no border fence. The cartels are tunneling under the fence, but of course, I'm sure everybody's kind of familiar because you watch the news, is there isn't fence on the entire border because of terrain and other environmental constraints that have prevented the completion of that fence. But of course, the cartels are extremely motivated and they've found ways to get through and to get across, and it's largely human trafficking that moves between the border checkpoints. Next slide. Okay, so the main challenge is, right, of course, sort of as it is with most of our national security challenges, it's a problem of resources, right? We don't have enough personnel, either in Customs or Border Protection and Border Patrol, to check every car and to control every mile of border. The second challenge and the second limitation is technology. It's improving, as you can see. These are some really advanced X-ray and sort of millimeter wave technology, and you can see that they render really sharp, crisp images, but what they need is essentially more money in order to provide that technology and sort of enhance it with artificial intelligence. The second is volume. There is way too much crossing the border to control effectively. And finally, authorities. And this is one thing that a lot of people don't know, is that the United States military, despite the fact that they're kind of being deployed down to the border, are not allowed to operate in a law enforcement capacity. And so the deployment of US troops to the border really is of symbolic value or limited value. And so figuring out how to get around those problems are going to be important. Okay.
Just to clarify, that's a legal thing.
Yes.
It's not a policy.
Yes, no, that's not a policy thing. That is written into law. The US military doesn't have the authorities to operate in a law enforcement capacity. Yeah. Okay, next slide. All right, so Chinese economics and great power competition. As I said, and as I mentioned, over the past 2 decades, we've sort of witnessed major Chinese penetration into Latin America in an economic sense. And China has become the region's largest trading partner overall, right? And the largest trading partner for most of the countries. And so everything highlighted in red is where China is the largest trading partner. And okay, next slide. Basically, the short version is that Chinese trade and investment aims to pull two major resources out of Latin America that sort of fuels their economic and military growth and makes them stronger. The first are metals, minerals, and energy. That's petroleum, that's copper, lithium, cobalt, and tin. And this is especially important for their electric vehicle revolution, as well as to fuel their industry and their factories. And the second is food. Primarily protein. That's beef, that's soy, and that's fish. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard sort of the Chinese illegal fishing that goes on, especially off the coast of Ecuador and Argentina. So that's increasingly problematic as well. Okay, next slide. And I'll sort of wrap up on this, is that Peru really gave us a great example of Chinese investment and Chinese economic gains and games actually that they're playing. And Peru, they're kind of focusing on three major investment areas. Number one is minerals. Number two is ports. And number three is physical infrastructure, that's sort of communications and transportation, as well as grid and electricity. And I can give you just quickly sort of three good examples that we saw while we were there. The first is the Las Bambas mine, which is up here in the Peruvian highlands. It's one of the biggest producers of raw copper in the entire world. That's Peru in general, and the mine in Las Bambas is one of the biggest mines in Peru. And currently, a majority, 2/3 stake of that is owned by a Chinese state-owned company, which allows them a lot of sort of leeway to determine what gets pulled out and where it goes. Next, last year, China completed a big megaport project at Chancay, that's just north of Lima. It will be exclusively operated by the Chinese shipping company COSCO, which I'm sure some of you have heard of. And the port is really, that's the bad Costco, not the good Costco where we get all our free samples and everything. The port is intended really to be China's new gateway into Latin America, and it will give them an immensely important foothold onto the continent. And from there, likely the next step is transportation infrastructure that's going to first connect the mine to the port, right? So the Chinese will have the opportunities to pull copper out of the ground, put it on their trucks, move it down the road that they own and operate to the port that they own and operate, and then move it out. But likely it's going to be a foothold for them to sort of expand a larger transportation infrastructure all throughout Latin America. China, and this is where things get really scary, also owns a majority of Lima's electricity generation capacity. They basically own their grid. And they outright own the public utilities. And that gives China immense potential leverage in the form of essentially being able to flip a switch and cut off electricity to 1/3 of the Peruvian population. And the Peruvians genuinely are concerned, and we're also concerned, that the Chinese will be able to sort of extract concessions in that regard. Okay, one more. Next slide. Chinese investment in these parts of the world really benefit from corruption and from weak state capacities. They hate transparency and they hate the rule of law because it really puts constraints on what they're able to do. And so, to lower operating costs, for example, they skirt environmental regulations, they skirt labor regulations. And so while the United States has invested a lot in greater transparency and democracy and the rule of law and labor rights and everything, the Chinese have been working fastidiously in order to try and to undermine that. And in turn, it has deeply negative and destabilizing effects on Peruvian politics and society. It feeds into the already existing corruption and undermines the rule of law. It's sparked widespread labor unrest, particularly among marginal and neglected populations, especially in the poor indigenous areas up in the highlands. The ongoing labor disputes at Las Bambas mine are a good example of this, and it's disrupted production as local communities protest unfair practices and pollution and environmental degradation. And then Chinese dumping of waste products, especially heavy metals, in turn has led to the contamination of water supplies. And one good example of this is Lake Titicaca, which is on the Peru-Bolivian border, has alarmingly high levels of heavy metals that includes lead and arsenic that's making the population sick. And a lot of that has to do with dumping and spillage from their mining operations. And Chinese impunity there fuels populations' discontent with their government and feeling that the state doesn't care about them. And one of the sort of knock-on consequences is it's fueling a desire of Peruvians, and this is true sort of across the region of these populations, that they don't have a future there and will lead them potentially to seek a life somewhere else, which is one of the things that's contributing to irregular migration up towards the United States. See, I'm at 15 minutes, and so I'm going to stop there. I'm happy to take any questions or talk.
Questions for Dr. Goodman?
I just have one, concerning, as you go to these different countries, we see the Chinese corruption and the overinvestment take over their infrastructure. Or do you find any feedback or pushback from the countries in terms of dealing with that corruption?
I think in some countries the answer is yes. And in Peru, surprisingly, there is an anti-corruption drive. I would say, what is it, the last 6 or 7 presidents are either in prison or under indictment or investigation for corrupt practices. And so there is sort of a civil society movement and sort of independent judiciary that is pushing back on this. But in too many places in Latin America, this is a cycle, right, where self-interested and corrupt people get into politics because they know it's a way to enrich themselves. And then that further undermines the drive towards government reform. And so corruption really is an endemic problem in a lot of parts of Latin America, and it's really only getting worse. And the United States has been working on better transparency, better anti-corruption efforts, but it really has been an uphill battle these past 2 decades.
Showing my age from the 80s and 90s when Sendero Luminoso was the insurgency. Yeah. It would seem that these social and environmental issues, especially with the indigenous people, would be ripe fodder for insurgency. What is that situation in Peru today? So
technically, Sendero Luminoso exists, right? And it lives on, and they've really kind of been contained into a small portion of Peru. And when we were working with their military, we got a briefing from their special forces about the ongoing counterinsurgency, where they talked about sort of the continuing activities of Sendero Luminoso, but then they kind of dropped the other shoe, so to speak, which was when they said that there are only about 150 to 200 active insurgents left, and that's their big domestic unrest problem. I think you're right, though. I mean, in a lot of ways, especially up in these indigenous areas in southern Peru, like the discontent is rife, and the conditions do potentially favor the emergence of armed groups. But one of the things that we saw, especially following on COVID, is the militarization of policing and counter-protest, where the army has been deployed to crack down on what started out as nonviolent protests, but have got sort of increasingly, let's call it, less nonviolent. And so we're kind of at an inflection point right now, and I would be curious to see what ends up happening with that. But the Army does seem to have a good handle on that problem, although having a good handle on that problem does mean engaging in, they've been accused of a lot of human rights abuses over the past couple of years, and so that's a problem as well. Yeah.
Jeremy, question on your end?
Yes, I was interested in the comments on Sendero, because when I was visiting in 1982, they were quite active, and I missed one bombing in a hotel by 24 hours and then encountered other people who'd been held up in their family homes at gunpoint. And so Sendero was also bringing down power lines in that time. So it's good to hear that security is much less a problem for Peru. What about American business in Peru? We've had traditional engagement with the mineral mining and all the rest, more in Chile than Peru, but ever since the Nixon and Kissinger administration. So is that still active for American businesses?
So in Peru, not nearly as much. as we used to be. And we had an opportunity to sit down with the American Chamber of Commerce in Peru. And they represent a lot of service provision, a lot less manufacturing and mining. And a lot of what they were saying is that they really did want more American investment. But the problem, frankly, that we run into is that it's just not a favorable business climate in Peru. And that has to do with the lack of sufficient levels of education, right? Because the United States, like China, relies to a great extent on unskilled labor, right? And so they don't require high education levels, but US companies, especially manufacturers, do rely to a great extent on skilled labor. So you don't have that, you don't have the transparency and the rule of law and the secure property rights that make Peru a, let's call it, attractive place for capital investment. And so that's one of the big struggles that the United States has faced. And the reality is that, you know, economic competition in Latin America between the United States and China is not really symmetric. And what I mean by that is we're not competing the same way because our economic models are kind of fundamentally different. And so they're looking at pulling natural resources out of the ground in sort of an export-driven model. And what we're looking to do is to build manufacturing and service capacity, which sort of creates local jobs and really boosts the local economy in the ways that that the Chinese don't. But the United States, to a great extent, US companies have been deterred from investing in Peru, and that was something that we ran into a number of times.
Thank you, Dr. Goodman.
Great.
Dr. Lassner, floor is yours.
What's the time look like still?
We're good. If you can give us 10, 15 minutes, then we'll question.
Good evening, everybody. Where are we on the slide? Shall we start with slide 2 there?
Another one. Yeah, 1 moment.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
Click on slide 2.
Just slide, if you just click slide 2, it's good enough.
Good,
Yeah.
now I can see it too.
All right, good. So again, just I was here last year, so for some of you this may be familiar, for others it might not be, right? What region are we talking about? We're talking about Central and Central Eastern Europe. This is an area of the world that during the Cold War from 1945 to really 1991 vanished from the map and then came back as suddenly as it had disappeared. And with it came a new bag of problems, I guess you could say, right? The reappearance of Central Europe at first, however, was kind of hailed as part of a world in which we were going to have an almost perpetual peace, or as Francis Fukuyama wrote of it, we would have the end of history, where liberal democracies would be on the march around the world, liberal open trade, elections, respect for human rights, and so on. And at least for the moment, it would be part of a Pax Americana. Next slide. In that world, very quickly, we have the ascension of many of these former East Bloc countries into first NATO and then into the European Union. So what you see here is the slide, all of these color codings here, those are all the ascensions into NATO by former East Bloc countries, right? And the first wave, well, the first one was actually East Germany, and thereafter came Poland and Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia actually at the time, and Hungary, and then it proceeded apace. And as that began to happen, what also began to happen was a current and a push in the West, but especially from the United States, for these new countries that were ascending into NATO to raise their expenditures to a 2% minimum in order to help modernize and make compatible their militaries with the United States, right? And so there is no actual 2% minimum as a rule in NATO. It's just a number that the US made up and kind of pushed out onto the Europeans because historically speaking, since 1945, the Europeans had never actually spent very much on military forces. Next slide, please. Actually, go back one slide. Just pick up with that. Right. At the same time as the wall comes down, we have two conflicts that I think are particularly interesting, the Gulf War and the Kosovo War. The first one being one in which the US kind of stands on the side of international law and norms and wants to prevent changes to the territorial status quo in the world, ones that are illegal. By standing up against them, right? And so the US with UN sanction and with a large coalition of countries, which included many Arab countries who were directly involved with it, leads the Gulf War in 1990-91. But then comes the Kosovo War, a short few years later, in which the United States again gets involved with its European allies this time, but which does not actually have UN sanction, right? And it is technically not legal. It's simply what the United States and its coalition partners are going to do. Next slide. That's followed by 9/11, which I would say is really the big game-changing moment in terms of the United States' posture at any rate, and the US interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq as part of a larger, broader objective of transforming countries into vibrant democracies, or at the very least, as Paul Wolfowitz put it at the time, democracies that are, quote, about as good as Romania. That for those of you who have not been to Romania, it's not such a vibrant democracy. We can talk about that later. But especially with respect to the intervention in Iraq in 2003, here the United States more or less throws caution to the wind and begins to pursue its own interests without really deciding whether or not, without really caring whether or not UN sanction and the international community is going to be behind that or not, if it fits into US strategic interests. Next slide, please. At the same time, the United States and its European allies start talking about NATO ascension and EU ascension for additional countries in the former East Bloc lands. And those at this time in the 06, 07, 08 period include, among others, Georgia and Ukraine. Right? This is under George Bush the Younger. And as that happens, you begin to see the first splits in NATO, because countries such as Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, which are now NATO partners, and Poland are firmly behind this policy. All the rest of NATO and Europe are not. Right? So this is a problem for the United States. Germany kind of leads the opposition, but Bush the Younger never really has an opportunity to address this because things go awry in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the United States' attention shifts. And as well, the Russians seize parts of Georgia in order to make it non-NATO and EU, in order to disrupt its ability to accede to the EU and to NATO. Next slide, please. All right, well, that brings us to the Central European security issues of the late O's and the teens. Essentially, what you begin to see here is competition between the United States and Russia for influence in the region, right? If you want to date where that happens, it doesn't just fall out of the sky in 2022, or for that matter, 2014, right? This begins already in the O's. As Russia gets back slowly on its feet, it begins to use energy, for example, as a weapon. It shuts off the gas supply to Ukraine in 06 and 08, which also shuts off the gas supply to Germany, Austria, Hungary, Slovakia, Slovenia, Czech Republic, Poland, right? So countries become concerned about this. This is also where we date the beginning of Nord Stream 1 and 2, right? This is Germany strategically deciding not only is it going to move in a green direction energy-wise, but because green energy cannot suffice all of its security needs or any Central European country's security needs, it's also going to have LNG, liquefied natural gas, coming out of Russia. That's going to go through this Nord Stream, which, however, is going to bypass all of the former East Bloc countries and go directly from Russia into Germany. You can imagine Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, and Hungary don't appreciate that. Next slide, please. One other moment here. Yeah, so back again. This again, you see in 2014, the split, right? The V4 that you see right here, V4 in the Baltics, right? This is the Visegrad 4 group. This is a subgroup within the European Union and within really NATO that has, I would say, very different security concerns than the rest of Europe. And in particular, that Visegrad group is Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Czech Republic. For them, the major security issues were and remain Russia, number one, immigration and refugees, number two, energy, number three, cyber, number four. For the rest of the European Union, that looks very different. Despite what German rhetoric now has, which is Russia as number one, up until Trump and the latest affair in March of 2025, where J.D. Vance, our vice president, got up and sort of gave a shot across the bow of the European Union with respect to NATO. The chief concern for the rest of the European Union was, number one, refugees, migrants, and number two, energy. And number three, and this even depended really, Russia, right? Russia for Germany, not so much for Portugal, Spain, or Italy. All right, next slide, please. So in the late O's, early teens, the question in Central Europe became, what is going to be the major threats in the future? None of them really had a clear notion other than the migration issue, which was becoming bigger and bigger, and the need for security. But all of their national security and national military strategies had nothing in terms of a major conflict will happen in Europe for at least the next 10 years, right? And at that, they were utterly wrong, I guess you could say. I threw this up here, not because you can read it, but this comes out of a Marine Corps manual that deals with the likelihood that you could historically have predicted where the next strategic threat comes from. And the interesting about it is, no matter what age you're looking at, virtually no one gets this right. So in that sense, the Europeans aren't so much to be roundly criticized as just neatly falling into the broad historical pattern. Next slide, please. All right, and then of course you guys know came 2014, where the Russians seized Crimea and begin to support essentially a low-intensity war, a guerrilla war with some regular and irregular forces in the Donbass and eastern portions of Ukraine. So that starts in 14. Equally in 14, of course, there is an overthrow of the government in Kiev, right? And in that sense, what happens is, the US and the Russians are competing for influence here. The US, I would argue, outcompetes the Russians and gets rid of the more pro-Russian than the people we wanted leadership and replaces it. The Russians are furious about that, but it's the first sort of, I would say, major domino leading up to what we get in 22, right? Which is the US and the Europeans begin to win the game of influence in Ukraine. Beginning in 2014, then comes the seizure of Crimea by the Russians as a riposte. Go ahead and give me the next slide. The Russians, of course, miscalculate badly. It's easy to laugh, I guess, at the Russians on that, but it's only requires us to look back to Afghanistan, or more particularly to Iraq, to see us doing the very same things. I believe the steady beat on the Sunday morning talk shows in December 02, January 03, leading up to the invasion of Iraq was 2 weeks to 2 months, $2 billion. And I don't need to tell anybody here that that was wildly off the mark. The Russians too found that their anticipated, 2 days to 2 weeks, 2 billion rubles was wildly off the mark. And what they got instead, next slide please, has been a war of attrition. Has descended, I should say, into a war of attrition with the Ukrainians, in which both sides are bleeding heavily. We can come back to that and chat about it in the Q&A, a little bit about that. Go to the next slide, please. All right, and this sort of brings us to, the countries we visited both last year and this year. I leave this German slide up. We didn't go to Germany this year, but the Germans had a major federal election this year. And the right won heavily in that election, especially on a platform that was NATO skeptic and anti-immigrant, migrant, refugee, depending on whose side you're on that particular argument. That said, the second largest party, the AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland, Alternative for Germany, were excluded from the coalition government, even though they came in second in terms of the votes. The CDU, the Christian Democrats in Germany, said, we will not, under any circumstances, make a coalition government with them. And so they ended up taking the third and fifth largest parties to build the current coalition government. So the current coalition government under Merz in Germany today is a traffic light, as they call it, government of the Christian socialists, right? That's the yellow. The socialists, the SPD, Sozialistische Partei Deutschlands, that's the red, and the Greens, all right, that's your coalition. And they are now faced with the Trump and Vance platform of Europe, you need to get involved in securing your own borders while this war in Ukraine will, so says the Trump administration, be unwound. Suffice to say, the Germans and the rest of the Europeans are in quite a conundrum. Germany itself still has not found its legs as of today to lead this thing. The biggest problem within Germany, which will continue to be the problem in the coming weeks, months, I would say years, is that it's a coalition government. And the Christian socialists are at odds with the socialists and the Greens, especially when it comes to military spending. Next slide. All right, I'll move through these rather quickly so we can have some Q&A. This is just the Czech Republic, again, rearming as it is right now, mostly with European equipment, has met and exceeded the 2% minimum that used to be the US's requirement. Now, of course, the Trump administration is saying it really needs to be more like 4 or 5%. The Czechs are nowhere near there. They are, I would say, completely out of the loop when it comes to what the French, the Germans, the Brits, the Italians, and the Spanish are trying to put together as a larger, more effective military presence in Europe. Right? They're still lagging well behind that. Next slide. The Poles represent, I would say, well, certainly the most determined of any European state in Europe by far, in terms of nationalism, in terms of sheer grit and determination, in terms of buying military equipment. They've not only exceeded the 2%, they're almost up to 5%. And I would say, to go one even further, they're the only ones that actually want a war with the Russians. I mean, if it weren't for the US, I have no doubt that the Poles would fly a couple F-16s right into Ukraine, armed to the teeth tomorrow. All right. I might add that the Poles are also the only nation in Europe that is so radically pro-US, incredibly oriented to the US. They want a firm alliance with the US. And as one of the Polish generals said to us while we were over there, Poles love Americans more than Americans love Americans. Next slide. This brings us to Hungary. Hungary, I will just leave it up there, is the odd man out in terms of the NATO countries on the eastern side of NATO. They very much see themselves as a kind of broker, an international broker. They try to maintain a certain distance from NATO and its operations while leaning into Russia and China in order to get investment and make sure their energy supplies are secured, while all the time saying, yes, we're good NATO members, and if push came to shove, you could rely on us, but never really saying how that would be. They are the only NATO country on the eastern side that does not allow Western arms to flow into Ukraine across their border. And that has to do with the Ukrainians living on the other side of the Hungarian-Ukraine border, which the Hungarians consider to be Hungarians and not Ukrainians. Next slide, please. All right, and I'll finish with this. Future challenges. What happens to NATO as of now with Trump and Vance's statements? You know, the question is the U.S. going to completely pull out of NATO, simply reduce its presence in Europe and turn it over to the Europeans if and when they can get their act together? We'll see. The migration and immigration refugee problem is still a major one in Europe, shows no signs of abating. The financial and economic crisis in Europe is large, and it stands to get worse. It was already a disaster due to the energy price spikes, which have only gotten worse and worse and worse, and which are now going to get worse thanks to American tariffs. Healthcare and pension systems, therefore, are under heavy pressure. This is going to be fought over in every national assembly, especially if it comes to some government or another saying, hey, we want money for rearmament. And then, obviously, what the military budgets are going to finally be. All right. Thank you for your attention.
One thing that I have not heard talked a whole lot about in the media or anyplace else, and this is going back to the 2014 with Crimea, was the Budapest Agreement. The Ukrainians agreed to give up their nuclear weapons. And as I recall, the US, I think the Brits, and the Russians were signatories to it with a non-specified means to guarantee Ukrainian territorial sovereignty. I know you mentioned several times about the UN hadn't sanctioned certain things, but in reality, whether you're sanctioned by the UN or any place else, a piece of paper seems to be totally worthless when it comes to somebody deciding on their own national interests. Is there any sense of regret or in hindsight on any of the European powers that had they been more forceful in 2014, they might not be in the quagmire they are today?
Well, with respect to that particular angle, right, whether or not the Europeans are ruining not having taken more forceful action, I think the answer would have to be a pretty resounding no, if only because the European militaries are barely functional. And when I say barely functional, Der Spiegel, which you may or may not know is the big German weekly magazine, which is essentially the mouthpiece of the German government, ran an expose a year and a half ago when von der Leyen, who's currently the head of the European Parliament, was still the German Minister of Defense. And it detailed the condition of the kit of the Bundeswehr. And we're talking about most of the arms and equipment less than 5% operational. I mean, there were 3 Tornado fighters flying in the entire Luftwaffe, 3. There were, 28 Leopards, serviceable, 400 that didn't run, right? And that goes through the whole, they were having a new, for some of you can watch this on YouTube, with the Bundeswehr out marching with brooms because they didn't have enough guns to put out to the recruits. And this is having gotten rid of universal military training. So it's an all volunteer force now. They can't even, so, and that is broadly the case across the European Union. So in 14, even if the most hawkish European politician had decided we got to do something now, there was nothing to do it with. And moreover, the problem is that all of the Central European economic policies were all built and based upon the strategic assumption that they were going to have liquefied natural gas out of Russia at cut rate prices into an indeterminate part of the future. And no politician would have been in parliamentary democracies where every government is susceptible to a vote of no confidence. None of those elected officials could have risked going down over a decision to try to provoke a war with Russia. So I think the answer is no. I think that as much they might not have liked what was happening, there was nothing they could actually do to stop it.
There's nothing they could have done. That was not enough of an impetus for them to get ready that would have potentially offset.
I don't think this is enough actually either. It's enough for the Poles, it's enough for the Latvians, Lithuanians, Estonians, but it's probably enough to keep the Finns and the Swedes now into it. But it's still not enough for the Germans or the Austrians or the Italians or the Spaniards or the Portuguese.
President will take the last question as his prerogative. France was not mentioned, and I know your focus was on Central Europe, but please give us a quick assessment of the French in this.
Well, I mean, the French under Macron have been trying to step into some sort of leadership role in all of this. Macron is become wildly unpopular in France. France politically these days is something of a mess, right? You have Le Pen surging forward and her far-right party surging forward in the polls. Just last week, they decided to disbar her from elections for 5 years because of what they said was election fraud that she had engaged in. That was determined evidently a number of years ago, but they put off sentencing, and then they sentenced right as we're coming up on the elections. How convenient. That's made an even more contentious election out of what was already a contentious election. But again, the French suffer from the same thing that everyone else does in Europe. These are tiny little militaries without much capability, with no logistical capacity to speak of. I used to make the comment that it was lucky for everybody that if a war did take place in Eastern Europe, right, Poland, Ukraine, what have you, the Germans were going to end up being the logistical hubs with German rail rolling all that stuff up to the front. But for anybody who's been paying attention, Germany is in utter disarray in terms of its transportation network these days. So it couldn't even move French stuff over to Eastern Europe if it wanted to. So, the French are, I would say, despite the best attempts at Macron at putting a good face on all of this, and despite Macron's comments over the last 2 years that he thought Europeans should be prepared to go and fight in Ukraine, which I think is really out of step with most European views, right? Because that begs the question of whether or not all of Europe would be prepared for a mid to large size conflict on the European continent over Ukraine. I think that he is going to fade into irrelevance, and I think this election, we'll see who wins it, but I think we're going to be seeing the last of Macron pretty soon.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, a big hand for our speakers. I'll encourage any of you who have further questions to engage with them afterwards. A quick reminder, May 6th will be our final program for the spring. The Myth of Soft Power by Dr. Lassner And so please join us for that. We'll be getting more information out about that. And anyone interested in engaging with Ukrainians who will be coming to Alabama, please come see me. Thank you again for coming out tonight. Thank you.